Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to discuss about Beltran's Russell theory on definite descriptions. Russell's theory of descriptions remain an outstanding contribution to philosophy of language. It has provided a productive framework for philosophers to think about the role of quantification in language. He introduced definite descriptions in order to solve puzzles in the philosophy of language, such as the puzzle of negative existentials and the Bald King of France. He claimed that while definite descriptions seem to behave like names, they actually took a much different logical form, like A is equals to X is equals to B, so then B is equals to A. For example, Ed is the biggest would mean that for all people, if someone is the biggest, then that someone is Ed. Another example is Alexandra, Rasputin, and Felix Yosipov are proper names. Phrases that start with a definite word the, such as the wife of the last czar, the monk she admired, and the man who shot that monk, are considered definite descriptions. Russell was generally suspicious of the notion of Frege view of sense. First is ordinary proper names and definite descriptions are singular terms. Then, ordinary proper names and definite descriptions all have sense as well as perhaps as reference. He further questioned the crucial things about the notion of a singular term used in third statement of Frege, which are: first, the business of a singular term is to refer to an object. Second, a sentence containing a singular term has no truth value if there is no object corresponding to that singular term. For additional information, on denoting, Russell refers to Frege's sense as meaning, and Frege reference is included within his use of the term denotation. Russell denies Frege's third claim for the case of definite descriptions, which he thinks will enable him to deny the fourth claim of Frege, and avoid appealing to the notion of sense altogether. Next is the problems. Russell treats Frege's notion of sense as a theoretical notion designed to deal with certain problems. Thus, he created his own alternative theory to deal with these problems, which denies both the third and the fourth claim of Frege. The first problem is how identity statements can be both true and informative. Second, how there can be a difficulty in swapping within psychological or epistemic contexts, such as believes that, discover that, words which have the same ordinary reference. And the third, how something meaningful can be said using ordinary proper names and definite descriptions which refer to no existing objects. Russell also introduced us with the concept basic worry. It is the meaning of words relates to things in the world rather than things in our minds. We will further discuss this later on. The fourth problem here is how the law of excluded middle applies to sentences including such phrases as the present king of France, given that there is now no king of France. The problem 5 now is how there can be true denials of existence of the apparent form and does not exist. The law of excluded middle says that for every meaningful sentence, either it or its negation is true. Thus, if the King of France is a singular term, then according to the rule of the second singular term above, neither sentence can be really true, since there is now no King of France. Russell thinks that logic demands that the law of excluded middle be upheld, so there's a problem with thinking of phrases like the friends of France as singular terms. As for problem 5, consider the sentence. Santa Claus does not exist. If Santa Claus is a singular term, then according to the second rule of the singular term, the first sentence could have no truth value. The problems 4 and 5 cannot be solved by introducing the notion of sense, if the second rule of the singular term is still maintained, and it's clear that Frege himself accepted the second rule. Modifying the second rule of the singular term can help with problem 5 and problem 3 if it contains singular terms which are really true or false, even though there are no real objects corresponding to the singular terms. Dropping the second rule, might also help with the problem 4. Consider the phrase the King of France. If the second rule is dropped, we could say that this unreal object either was or was not bald, and this would allow us to preserve the law of excluded middle. However, dropping the second rule seems to offer no solution at all to problems of 1 and 2. Next, we will discuss Russell's solution and outline. Russell created a revolutionary approach to the problems by assimilating them into a quite different class of expressions. This is what he calls denoting phrases. Russell gives no very clear definition of this term. He introduces it by means of a range of examples: a man, some men, any man, every man, all men. These phrases all receive a particular kind of analysis in the logical system invented by Frege and developed by Russell himself. Actually, all these phrases involve quantifiers. A quantifier is an expression which specifies some quantity of a given group. Consider the sentence: Yusupov shot someone. The Fregean analysis sees this as involving a one-place predicate, which Russell seems on denoting to call a propositional function, like Yusupov shot X. The Fregean system represents the second sentence by attaching the quantifier "there is at least one X" such that to the front of third sentence to get this. In on denoting, Russell attempted to explain what this kind of expression means. In his terms, the fourth sentence means this: the propositional function, in other words, Yusupov shot X, is sometimes true. A bit more colloquially, we might represent the sentence 4 like this: there is at least one object which Yusupov shot. Russell is claiming that definite descriptions are quantifier phrases. The difference between some and the is simple. Some means there is at least one object which. The means there is exactly one object which. Another example is the sentence 5, the present King of France is bald. For Russell's analysis, there is exactly one object which is now King of France, and that object is bald. Or, there is at least one object which is now King of France. And the second, there is at most one object which is now King of France, and whatever is now King of France is bald. On his analysis, the phrase the present King of France is not a name of the present King of France, any more than some man is a name of some man, and the phrase has no meaning on its own, although it's meaningful enough in the context of a sentence. But on its own, the phrase the present King of France does not mean there is exactly one present King of France, since it's not a sentence. These 2 points are themselves developments of Russell's deep thought that the superficial appearance of a sentence is not a reliable guide to its structure. Next, we're going to discuss Russell's solution in detail. How does Russell's approach deals with problems 1 to 5? In problem 1, here's an identity statement involving definite descriptions. In problem 1, the example sentence here is the morning star is the evening star. The problem arises from treating the definite descriptions as singular terms. Russell's analysis of 6 makes it equivalent to something like this. First, there is exactly one object which is a morning star. Second, there is exactly one object which is an evening star. Third, whatever is a morning star is an evening star, and vice versa. The crucial part of the claim effectively says that the predicates X is a morning star and X is an evening star are equivalent in the sense that they apply to the same thing. The second problem concerned substitution in psychological contexts. Recall the case of Carol, the classicist who has heard of both the evening star and the morning star, but doesn't know that they are one and the same. Example sentence: Carol thinks that the evening star appears in the evening. So, it seems that the phrases the morning star and the evening star have the same normal reference, but that still doesn't mean that the following sentence is true. Like, Carol thinks that the morning star appears in the evening. Russell's official response to this is that we should only expect sentence 8 to be derivable from sentence 7. If we supposed that definite descriptions are singular terms which have an isolable meaning of their own, which is what his theory denies. According to Russell, these definite descriptions cannot be analyzed outside their contribution to whole sentences. Russell protects his treatment of problem 2 with a further observation. This is that there are two readings of sentences like sentence 7, which are brought out clearly in his analysis. Notice the position of the phrase, there is exactly one object which is an evening star in the following two sentences. First, Carl thinks that there is exactly one object which is an evening star, and that object appears in the evening. And the second sentence, there is exactly one object which is an evening star, and Carl thinks that object appears in the evening. In the first sentence, we say that one of the things which Carl thinks is that there is exactly one thing which is an evening star. We don't say that in the second sentence. In fact, the second sentence, we simply say for ourselves that there is exactly one thing which is an evening star before reporting what Carl thinks about it. The scope of the phrase of the first sentence, Carl thinks that, is wider than that of the phrase, there is exactly one object which is an evening star. In the second sentence, the situation is reversed. The phrase, there is exactly one object which is an evening star, does not occur within the scope of the phrase, Carl thinks that. We may then say that it has wider scope than the phrase, Carl thinks that. Narrow scope and wide scope are different terminologies used by Russell to analyze the evening star and Carl thinks. According to Russell, though he used a different terminology, there are narrow scope and wide scope readings of the definite description in the seventh sentence. We can take the description, the evening star, to occur within the scope of Carl thinks that. We might make the wide scope reading, the one where the description is outside the that clause, clear in more or less everyday terms by rephrasing it like this. Concerning the evening star, Carl thinks that it appears in the evening. Russell thinks that even though definite descriptions are not isolable semantic units, there is no harm in swapping the morning star for the evening star and its position in the wide scope reading. Next example is the sentence 5. The present king of France is bald. According to what Russell calls the law of excluded middle, either the sentence 5 or the following sentence must be true. For example, it is not the case that the present king of France is bald. The difficulty is that if the present king of France is a singular term, and the second rule of the singular term is true, then neither the sentence 5 nor the sentence following with it can be true. According to Russell, sentence 5 is false because it's equivalent to this. There is exactly one object which is now king of France, and that object is bald. But we can read the description as having narrow scope, which will then make the second sentence next to the 5 equivalent to this. It is not the case that there is exactly one object which is now king of France and that object is bald. Thus, the second sentence here is true. So if we read the sentence of Russell in the manner of the second sentence, the law of excluded middle can be seen to hold, or outside it. Now, let's move on to problem 5, the problem of denying existence. Here's a sentence of the relevant form. Sentence 9, the present king of France does not exist. By using Russell's standard analysis of definite descriptions, we can create a subset of 9 sentence. There is exactly one object which is a present king of France, and that object does not exist. On a Russellian view, the problem with 9 arises from being uncritical about the word exist. This seems to be part of a predicate X exist, but if this is really a predicate, the variable must mark a place where a singular term could go. So what does exist mean? The Russellian view exist as a part of a quantifier, there is an object. In that case, since there is already such a quantifier involved in sentences using definite descriptions, there must be malformed about sentence 9. This is a natural thought anyway. Instead of sentence 9, we would surely prefer to say something like this: there is no present king of France. Finally, let's turn to the last remaining problem, the problem 3. So it's about the meaningfulness of names and descriptions which refer to no existing objects. Here's a sentence using such a term. So we're gonna assume the Greek gods don't really exist. Sentence 10, Apollo is jealous. If we look up the name Apollo in a classical dictionary, we are likely to find that Apollo is the sun god. Russell's proposal is simple. We take the name Apollo to be equivalent in meaning to some definite description, like the sun god, and that definite description is then analyzed in Russell's usual way. So the sentence 10 then becomes equivalent to this: there is exactly one object which is a sun god, and that object is jealous. Or 10R is certainly meaningful, though presumably it's false. Next, we have the opposing theories of Russell's claim, and we have Strawson here. Strawson claims that we cannot properly say that a sentence is true or false, or that a word or phrase refers to an object because certain semantic terms are not properly applied to sentences, words, and phrases at all. To sum it up, Strawson's claims are this. First, the sentence itself cannot be said to be true or false. Second, it is only uses of sentence which can be true or false, and only uses of words or phrases which are referring. And the last one, the unique existence of an object which satisfies the description is presupposed. Recall Russell's famous example in sentence 5. Russell's analysis makes it simply false because there is no present king of France. Strawson, however, claims that if there is no present king of France, a non-fictional use of sentence 5 is not false. Rather, the question of its truth or falsity does not even arise. Strawson's overall claim can be put like this: there are certain central uses of definite descriptions which are referring uses. If a use of a description is a referring use, then the person who uses the description does not assert the unique existence of an object which satisfies the description, as Russell thought. Instead, the unique existence of an object which satisfies the description is presupposed. Actually, Strawson follows Frege's claims. However, Russell claimed that they were never referring expressions. Another claim that opposes Russell is of Keith-Donnellian claims. Keith-Donnellian complicates this simple picture. He claims that there are both referential and non-referential uses of definite descriptions. In this, he disagrees with both Frege and Russell. But he claims that the referential uses do not rest on the presupposition that there is exactly one thing which satisfies the description. In this, he disagrees with Frege and Strawson. To simply put it, Donnellian claims that there are both referential and non-referential uses of definite descriptions, and second, the referential uses do not rest on the presupposition that there is exactly one thing which satisfies the description. He thinks that Russell's account is wrong for the attributive uses, and Strawson is wrong for the referential uses. Russell's 1905 account of definite descriptions analyzed them as object-independent, non-referring terms. Russellian view from referentialists who argue that at least some definite descriptions, those appearing in what Donnellian called referential uses, are indeed referring terms. Some referentialists extend the claim to indefinite descriptions as well. Russellians respond by learning heavily on the distinction between what is literally said and what is pragmatically communicated, in order to preserve a semantic unity in definites. Now let's discuss the Russellian defenses. The Russellian will attempt to meet the remaining criticisms brought by Strawson and Donnellian by making two distinctions. First, between what is strictly true or false and what is helpful or unhelpful in a conversational context. Second, between what is strictly and literally said in a use of a sentence and what a speaker means in uttering it. Consider to begin with, Strawson's objection that someone who utters the present king of France is bald is not asserting that there is exactly one present king of France. Why does Strawson say this? Because he says no normal speaker would respond to an utterance of such a sentence by saying that's untrue. But the resilient will not find this evidence convincing. The resilient will think that the everyday's reaction can be explained in another way. In general, in ordinary conversation, when we use definite descriptions, there is no doubt about the existence of something to which a description applies. We talk about the moon and the sun. They are visibly there. We wonder whether we have locked the front door. Of course, the front door exists. According to the Russellian, our reluctance to say that the present king of France is bald is false, arises from a reluctance to say something misleading, rather than a reluctance to say something's false. Taking the evidence in Strawson's way, the Russellian will claim is failing to make distinction. Actually, reluctance is to say something misleading, rather than a reluctance to say something's false. Strawson's other objection, involving a case where there is more than one thing which satisfies the description. The Russellian is aware, of course, that most definite descriptions do not say enough explicitly to ensure uniqueness. To discuss more, we're going to talk about the Russellian to the second objection of Strawson. Let's take the example of the sentence 13, the door is locked. No Russellian imagines that we are asserting that there is only one door in the world. Instead, the Russellian will suppose that the context normally restricts our attention sufficiently to ensure that only one door could be relevant. If something is uttered in the imagined circumstances, nothing true or false has been said. Strawson assumes that what the speaker says is just what the speaker wants to say, and this is what the Russellian will deny. The Russellian will say that the meaning of words is independent of what any particular person may mean by them, and will claim that the strict and literal meaning of sentences containing definite descriptions is given by the Russellian analysis in terms of quantifiers. Of course, a particular speaker may use circumstances, but what the speaker conveys or means to convey is not the same as what she strictly and literally says. The differences between the Russellian view and its critics are manifestation of a deeper difference between their approaches to the philosophy of language. Additional information, we're going to talk about Russell's beyond descriptions. One of Russell's principal motives in producing his theory was a distrust of Frege's notion of sense. So, in the basic worry, the view that the meaning of words concerns things in the world rather than things in our minds. Frege used a very austere notion of reference. Sentences refer to truth values, predicates to functions from objects to truth values, and supplemented that with a notion of sense to deal with a basic worry which that seems to make so acute. The Russellian alternative begins with a richer notion of reference. Sentences refer to facts or situation, and predicates to qualities or relation, and makes no appeal to sense at all. Lastly, Russell's propositions are the bearers of truth and falsity. They are what we think with, and so, in their way, are thoughts. Russell did not endorse truth conditions over and above propositions, nothing like senses. A given proposition will be true under such and such conditions, and false under so and so conditions. There is nothing else to meaning for Russell. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening, and I hope you learned something.